This week on the Communicators, interviews from the Gov 2.0 Summit held at the Washington Convention Center here in Washington, D.C.
The Communicators is on site at the Gov 2.0 Expo. We're talking with Denise Ross with the Greater New Orleans Community Data Center. She serves as their deputy director. What kind of data does your center collect?
We collect the data that's important to our audience. So that changes depending on what the audience's needs are. Before the storm, we focused, our audience was primarily nonprofit agencies, and so we focused on information that they would need to write effective grant proposals, plan their programs to make the most impact with limited resources in the community. And then when Katrina hit, the environment changed. That all of that census data that we had organized by neighborhood to be really easy for people to use, that was instantly obsolete and historical. So we had to start figuring out who's our new audience, what are the questions that they have, and what data might be available that can answer those questions.
When you start figuring out those questions, what's the process and how does it help you develop the information that you want to send to those who consume your material?
Well, now that we've been around for more than a dozen years now, and so that means we have a very strong audience. Our website gets about 100,000 unique monthly visits a year. And people come to us and they ask us questions. So when they ask us questions, we know we can get our finger on the pulse of what folks are looking for. And after the storm, what people needed was basic information on who's back in New Orleans and where are they living. And so that instructed us. It was really clear what we needed to do then is find out what's the best source for population data post-disaster. So we conducted a thorough review of the disaster literature, and we looked at public school enrollment, voting, traffic patterns, and postal data emerged as the best viable option for tracking repopulation of our city.
So it helps to find out who's coming back to the city, who's staying there currently. But who's the users besides the average consumers? Is it the New Orleans government itself that uses this information?
We have, well, what's sort of beautiful about a simple data set like population is that everybody needs the information for basic decision making. So neighborhoods wanted to know how repopulated their neighborhood was, and in particular, like, is there a block that's almost at the tipping point for being full of people again, and are there some interventions that could be done on those borderline blocks to help bring people back. Health clinics needed to know where they should place themselves so that they could distribute health services. For evacuation planning, need to know where folks are living. If you're going to put in a fast food restaurant or a grocery store, businesses, housing developers, everyone needs to know how many people are back and where are they living.
Since the title says Community Data Center, how are you supported in this effort?
Well, we're a neutral entity, which is really important. So we aren't tied to any government entity or administration. We don't get paid to make data, and then we'll only give it to you if you give us money. So the idea is that we're funded by mostly private foundations, and our mission is to democratize data. And so we want to make data that's important for community decision making available to all of the stakeholders.
As far as the information that's collected, you listed a lot of things. What fascinated you most about the information that you come out, especially post-Katrina?
Post-Katrina, we, right after the storm, I thought that at any minute we would be rescued with federal statistics that would just tell us, what was happening in New Orleans. And I think there's a misconception, definitely, that like in Star Trek, you could just scan the planet and figure out how many people are back and, all of these special characteristics of them. But it's really shocking how hard it is to get a handle on basic information in a post-disaster context. I remember just a few months after the storm, somebody from the Brookings Institution was quoted in the New York Times saying it was easier to get data about the rebuilding of Iraq than it was New Orleans. And that's definitely true. And what we had to go through to get that basic repopulation data is pretty interesting, because once we figured out that households actively receiving mail was probably going to be the best indicator of how many households were back, then we learned that the Postal Service can't share that address level data. But they do have some arrangements with for-profit companies if they meet certain qualifications. And so the company that sends your, I guess you call it junk mail and the missing children's postcard, their name is Velasas. And right after the storm, they happened to shelve the June 2005 address data. And And they, when we contacted them, they said, oh, we've got some pre-Katrina address data for you. So they donated that to us, and they provide regular updates of addresses actively receiving mail in New Orleans.
Do you do first-hand information gathering as an organization, or do you depend on other agencies like the Census Bureau and things like that?
We depend on other agencies. There has been a lot of activity since the storm of neighborhoods collecting their own data just as a matter of survival, and they've gotten really good at finding out, what information do they need to make their neighborhoods a better place. But what we do is we look for administrative data sets that are going to be used by decision makers to make decisions, and then we figure out how to package that data so it's really useful for people who aren't data experts to get involved.
And I noticed on the site there are plenty of maps and graphics and things like that to help, and is that a part of helping people understand how the data looks?
Maps and graphics are really crucial, and we do extensive usability testing. In fact, I remember being evacuated from Katrina, and we were monitoring our web stats, and I was in this hotel in Webster, Texas, and I was in the business center, and I knew that what people wanted was elevation by neighborhood. Our web stats showed that was a really hot topic of people coming to our website. And so I asked my colleague who was in San Diego at the time, I said, can you make a map of elevation by neighborhood? And she was already working on it. So she sent me a prototype, and I pulled it up in the business center, and she had chosen the color blue to indicate elevation. And of course, everyone freaked out because they thought it indicated flooding. And so I had this impromptu user test, and I was so grateful that I had those people there to interpret the map so that we wouldn't make that horrible mistake of publishing the blue map with elevation data.
As far as the ability to put this data out there, what lessons are to be learned, especially from those who attend this conference and who deal with communities and the kind of information they need to run efficiently?
One thing that I've really been impressed with at this Gov 2.0 conference is that there's this intense focus on the users and what information they need and what decisions they need to make with data. And so that certainly is always the place to start. There's too much information in the universe to try to catalog it all and make it all useful, especially because it's so resource intensive to bring a piece of data to the point where it's usable for the masses. And so always taking that user-centered approach, start with who's your audience, what decisions do they need to make, what's the data set that's going to be the best fit for that, and then how do I design the data to support decision making.
As far as those looking for post-Katrina information, is it still as consistent as 5 years later now, as far as people looking for information about how New Orleans is coming back?
Well, the local community certainly is always needing data to decide, to advocate on our own behalf and make decisions as neighborhoods and nonprofits, and just to figure out what we need to do next. And the media certainly has stayed interested. It's turning more into anniversary journalism. So with the 5th year anniversary of Katrina coming up, there's certainly a renewed interest. Anytime a storm approaches, of course, there's a renewed interest. And now Census 2010 will be released soon, and so that'll relieve a lot of the burden because we'll be back to some of the basic information that we had before the storm.
Denise Ross is the Deputy Director for the Greater New Orleans Community Data Center. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Elizabeth Losh, you talked here at the Gov 2.0 Expo, and the title of your talk was, "If you can't control the data, consider the message." What was the message you were trying to send by that talk?
Well, I think there's a tendency to assume that when there's a government website, it's all about just transmitting information, sort of pure information as a commodity that everyone can instantly understand, and it's always going to be transparent. But the point that I was trying to make is that there's always rhetoric involved, and that you have to sort of think critically about the kinds of forms of rhetoric that you're promulgating to the public. So I actually had a list of 12 don'ts that I talked about, which were things like don't pander, don't promise what you can't deliver, don't get too far ahead of yourself, don't live for the moment, sort of talking about sort of different problems that I see in the kind of public communication strategies of government agencies.
And has this become more urgent because a lot of this information now is going out digitally?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the recent Pew survey indicated that more and more Americans are contacting the government via websites, and that they're then participating in sort of retasking and remixing that data in new forms. So a lot of people are actually going to their elected representatives' websites, finding information there, and then retasking it for some other purpose. We often talk here about things like blogs and Twitter, but what's interesting to me is how average citizens are using old-fashioned stuff like email, often for promulgating information. So you'll see, somebody will set up essentially a viral email that they'll send to all their friends that will contain political information in it. And I think, it's important not to forget sort of Web 1.0 technologies when we're talking about all these things.
So in the realm of rhetoric, you talked about some of the issues you talked about, but talk about the larger issues of the government, especially when it puts out information and how it crosses into rhetoric.
Well, it's funny, if you look up the word rhetoric on the whitehouse.gov site in their search engine, what you'll find out is that rhetoric is a bad thing, right? Rhetoric is something that our political opponents do. Rhetoric is something that our, global enemies are busy with. Rhetoric is something that terrorists do. It's not something that we do. But of course the problem is that all of us are using rhetoric all the time. We always want to not only persuade people, but recognize a sense of occasion, right? Rhetoric is about recognizing the right words at the right time in the right place for the right context. And we all want to do that, right? That's not a bad thing to do. So as a teacher, I teach in a university, I have to think a lot about students have learned forms of communication for these sort of informal social networking situations that are really going to be inappropriate when they're in the professional world or in graduate school. And so I teach a course on digital rhetoric where we look at a range of different platforms and then talk about ways that they could be more successful media makers, because everybody has to be a spokesperson for something.
So when the government puts out information, is there rhetoric involved, even though it's in the guise of, or at least the desire of making it more transparent about its actions and workings?
Well, yeah, I mean, everything is going to be rhetorical. Everything, the colors that you pick for your, a pie chart demonstration are going to have a certain flavor to them. And things like maps. People have talked about maps being rhetorical for a long time. The way that, say, North America is represented on a world map, that has a rhetorical significance. If we're going to be this large geographical landmass that's sort of centrally located on the globe, that says something different from, if we're sort of represented proportionally with continents like Africa. So
talk a little bit about the other ways, at least from the way you see it, about these concerns about rhetoric when it comes to government putting out information. What concerns you most? I have a couple of concerns. I think one of my concerns is that government is not doing enough about information literacy, that there's a tendency, and I talk a lot about children's websites as an example of really bad government 2.0 often. These sites are created with cartoon characters and sort of fun and games, puzzles and mazes, and really children are not going to a government website because they want to play games or do puzzles or Mad Libs. They're there because they want to do school reports. And so we have this great opportunity to provide certain kinds of information literacy skills and teach kids about what's a credible source and what's not a credible source. And it's an opportunity that's totally getting missed because instead we're giving them puzzles and games, we're giving them cartoon characters, we're giving them everything they don't need and nothing that they do need. As a role of, say, if you were a consultant as far as these issues are concerned, what would you advise the government as far as going forward? Well, I mean, there's so many different things to consider. I actually give awards every year. They're called the Foleys. They're named after Mark Foley, the disgraced congressman who sent those inappropriate messages to underage pages. And they're awards for the worst examples of government media making in a given year. I think what's tricky is that government agencies speak to a lot of different audiences. And so you can't really have a one-size-fits-all solution to speaking to public audiences, right? There's going to be one form of communication might be appropriate, say, to HIV patients that might not be appropriate to, say, 65-year-old senior citizens who are worried about being over-medicated. So there might be sort of different discourse communities that are appropriate to different situations. So I think the main piece of advice I would have if I were a consultant is really make sure that you're creating vibrant communities around this material, rather than simply assuming that you know what people will like without knowing that there's a user base for it. I think that there's a mistake that's often made that's not made by, say, NASA. I mean, one of the reasons that NASA, I think, is a great example of a government website and have been really smart about government media making for a long time
is there's this long tradition of amateur astronomy and amateur rocketry in this country. So people have been interested in space exploration for a long time. They're also sort of UFO nuts, but you know, they're part of the public discourse too. So NASA, from the very beginning, understood that there would be citizens who would want to participate in forms of what we now call Gov 2.0. And so they were thinking about this from the very beginning, and they thought about it in a really smart, non-pandering, non-cheesy, non-advertising oriented way. I mean, I think one of the mistakes is that they hire a lot of people who are consultants who essentially come out of advertising and marketing, not out of government, not out of a sense of public service. And so you get people who are really oriented around thinking about the government as a brand, rather than thinking about the government as a set of deliberative processes that we all participate in. It's not a commodity, our government. Our government is a much more complicated thing than that.
Is there a component of this where not only is it one part how the government puts out information, but how the consumer takes that information and how they in turn use it as part of the rhetorical process?
Right, and one of the things I worry about is that far too often you see these sort of legalese notices on government websites where they're saying, oh, please don't, digitally alter this photograph, or this is property of the US government. And that sort of ignores the fact that we live in a remix culture, and part of how we participate politically, part of our political speech nowadays is how we use digital tools. And that's just, it's a form of political expression. So I worry that there's a kind of attempt to constrain free speech when we see these government websites where there are a lot of instructions about what not to do with their material. They want to keep that, and I understand they want to keep that message in that pure, unfiltered form that they originally intended it to be, but I just don't think that they can bar free speech in that way.
How did you start thinking about these issues?
Okay, this is kind of an odd story. I actually started thinking about e-government issues right out of college. I was running a delinquency prevention center for the California Youth Authority, and it had a computer lab. And I had gang members and kids who had been victims of abuse and kids who wanted to sort of overcome certain sort of socioeconomic barriers, kids of immigrants, immigrants themselves. And there was this program called PEN, the Public Electronic Network. And it was designed to get citizens in contact with their elected officials and encourage citizen participation and citizen communication about things like trash, homelessness, what were the other issues, parks. So I thought it'd be really cool to take these kids and put them on this network, give them email addresses. I mean, you have to remember this was 1991 or something, so this was before most corporate CEOs had email addresses. And I'm giving these like gang members email addresses. But of course, they weren't really interested in talking to their elected representatives. What happened is they ended up talking to each other. And so at the time, I saw this as being a huge failure, right? Because the kids are all on their computers sort of chatting, sometimes with people in the same room, like, on the computer. And I felt like, I couldn't recognize that as political speech. But now I do. I mean, it's a form of community building, it's a form of organizing, it's a form of action and language, so.
And you teach a course on this issue.
Yes, I do. In fact, I opened my course with what I call the tale of two college students. One student was a senior at Yale. His name was Alexei Vayner. If you Google the words world's worst resume or world's worst video resume, you'll come up with his video resume. He wanted a job in investment banking, and he created this video resume where he's shown tango dancing, skiing, weightlifting, and then he also says these really sort of pompous things about his knowledge about business and what he's going to tell his bosses to do correctly. It was a total disaster. It went viral on the internet. It was parodied on YouTube. There are lots of hilarious sort of send-ups of it. He got very upset, and he started making these takedown notices. And then people just got madder at him, and they went through his real resume and exposed the fact that he had misrepresented himself on several things. So he's the kind of bad example of digital rhetoric for a high school senior, college senior. And then I'd give them the good example, which is James Katecki, who was a Georgetown senior, who started interviewing, he started making videos to the candidates during the 2008 election. I don't know if you remember any of these videos, where he was analyzing the different candidates' YouTube channels and sort of saying who was good, who was bad, and sort of how they could reach a YouTube audience more effectively. Well, the candidates started watching James's channel, And then they started making videos back to James. And eventually some of them actually came to his Georgetown dorm room to be interviewed. So at the end of the course, we actually bring James onto our teleconference facility so that students can actually ask questions of James and sort of think about this question of how do they make themselves more like James Katecki. He ended up being a commentator on Politico.com, so it really, he took advantage of his opportunities. So, how do you be a James Katecki and not an Alexei Vayner? And that's sort of what the course does from there. And we go from everything from Facebook to Second Life. We cover the whole sort of range of different platforms.
Elizabeth Losh, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
At Gov 2.0 Expo here in Washington, D.C. with Kate Blado of ProBono.net. Can you tell us what that is?
ProBono.net is a nonprofit that works with organizations nationally and internationally on access to the court and access to legal information issues. We work on that through three things: volunteerism, collaboration, and technology. We have four platforms that we work with people, one being lawhelp.org, which provides free legal information to the public, ProBono.net, which provides support to pro bono attorneys and legal staff, Law Help Interactive, which helps people fill out forms, both the public and attorneys, and then Pro Bono Manager, which is a product we work on with law firms to help them manage their pro bono work.
Why specifically to this group of people are you offering the help? And how does technology play a day-to-day role in this?
Well, in terms of things that particularly on Law Help Interactive, that the courts are part of the government and that they tend to be a little bit opaque to the public, that the laws are complex, the processes aren't intuitive. And so these resources that we provide and with our partners that we take and sort of break that down for them so they can, if they're not able to afford attorneys, that they're able to sort of get access to the court and, through court forums or through legal information.
When you find what type of people what type of information people are looking for, what is that? What's the most common kind of advice and legal help that they're looking for?
Well, generally family law information is the most common. Things around divorce, child custody, domestic violence, people who need orders of protection to secure themselves and their children from their abusers.
And how many people have access to your sites, and how much traffic are you getting?
In terms of it, that our sites are pretty well trafficked. I don't know the specific numbers on lawhelp.org, but I do know that for Law Help Interactive, which helps people with forms, that we had about 146,000 documents generated last year, and that it was in a little more than 30 states where we have content.
As far as the help that you need to keep these platforms running, how many people are involved, and how many volunteers do you have in this effort?
It is ProBono.net itself is a pretty small organization that we have about sort of 15 to 20 people that are working there, but we have a gigantic network of partners. Pretty much we work with somebody in almost every state, and that it's actually our local partners who put the content together because all of the local laws are different, and that they also know their community the best to be able to sort of know what that community needs and where the volunteers are best used. And so I also don't have a number on the number of partners, but it is a huge number of people that support us, and some of them do volunteer work locally, but a lot of the resources are going into getting people to actually volunteer to take cases and represent people in court, because that's one of the greatest areas of need.
What's been the response from the court system?
In terms that they've generally been really receptive, that they find that when forms are filled out correctly and they're legible, that the cases move faster, that people are more prepared for court, they don't have to explain as much procedure, and so it makes their job easier, and that they don't want people to not be in court and sort of not resolve their problems, and so it allows them to assist those people as well.
I thought I read that in the information that New York State was working with you on these kind of issues too.
Yes, that we have several courts that are working with us. We work with Montana and California and New York. New York is a huge partner, that the courts there started out with an initiative in the New York City courts, and that they were working specifically on sort of landlord-tenant and name change, sort of really basic issues, because they found that in family court that 70% of people were coming to court without attorneys, and that in housing court 90% of people were coming without attorneys, and the clerks would see pleadings on all sorts of different things that, sort of the joke is that you get the pleading that's on a napkin, and that's not particularly useful. It doesn't allow somebody to explain their case or their circumstances very well in a way that the judge can use them. And that they took, and based on sort of their basic interviews for the New York City, that they expanded that program to the entire state. And last year they had 25,000 documents generated. And in the first quarter that they've almost generated half of that already, that they had 12,000 forms filled out by the public. And we get great comments that come in from them, people that are incredibly thankful for the resources, people who think, let us know that our service is better than peanut butter, and that they're great to have sort of see a website like this that works and is available for people who don't have the resources and could choose to buy forms, for $20 or $30, but instead can use that money to buy food for their family.
You told us what it does for the consumer. What does it do for the lawyers and those the volunteers? What's that community like?
Well, in terms of it, I think California is a great example of how they're using it with volunteers, that they have what are called self-help clinics, and basically that people come to the court and that they get, they're still representing themselves, but they get help from, centers to fill out the forms. And that for these, in particular, I'm thinking of a clinic around domestic violence, that they have one staff attorney who reviews the forms for completeness after they're generated, but in a year that they're able to help about 6,000 people. And it allowed them to stop faxing information back and forth, that this attorney is located remotely, so you would have a volunteer at the site where the customer is, and then they would fax it to the attorney, and then the attorney would have to fax it back, and that it took a lot of time. And if the fax machine broke down, they'd end up with a line of customers, and they're able to get rid of that and really help it out.
Kate Blado is with probono.net. Thank you.
Thank you.
You can see these and other interviews from the Gov 2.0 Summit by going to our Communicators website at cspan.org.